Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to everyone who's joining. I am really excited. I don't say this very often, but I'm exceptionally excited to be speaking with Hossam El-Hamalawy, who is joining us from Germany to address his new book, soon to come out, Counterrevolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic. And before I introduce Hossam, who is a dear friend from almost 20 years ago, and somebody that I followed religiously, perhaps the only religion I do, uh, which is following people from whom I gain a lot of insight. Hussam, كيفك?
Alan Bassam, always good to speak to you, Habibi.
So wonderful to speak with you and to see this fantastic intellectual production coming to fruition. I sort of lived with you the stages of development to an extent, and very happy that it's almost out. We will ask you all about it, and we will ask you to share with us your arguments in the book, how this book came about, and I have some specific questions. But before that, let me just share that Hossam Al-Hamalawy is a journalist and socialist from Cairo who was among the organizers of the 2011 uprising in Egypt. He has been involved in the labor movement and the fight against police brutality in Egypt. He holds a PhD in political science from Freie, please correct the spelling, Universität. I don't know. Is this gonna create
Just say Free University Berlin.
Free
That would
University of
fly.
Berlin? خلاص.
Uh,
He has a PhD from Freie University in Berlin and is the recipient of the 2011 Anna Politkovskaya Courage in Journalism Award. And courage is something that is very much associated with Hussam. This is my ad lib. He publishes a weekly newsletter on Egyptian politics at arabawi.substack.com, which I will actually put on the screen. His Substack is followed by so many people who would like to know what's going on in Egypt at a time when it seems that not much is going on, but indeed a lot is. And Hussam is the author of the forthcoming book from Verso, Counter-Revolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic, which we will feature throughout the conversation today. Hussam, before we start with anything else, how have you been doing, and how has your stay been in Europe, which I understand has been a while?
I guess I can't complain that much, other than the usual. Uh, I mean, in so many ways, Europe is increasingly becoming like our beloved global South, authoritarian dictatorships.
إحنا كمان.
So, yeah,
Also, we us too.
so I guess it's God's way to answer my nostalgia to Egypt. But other than that, I'm alive and kicking.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to feel at home because of these new dimensions emerging, not emerging, but sort of expanding, because they always were there, as we have
Yeah.
been writing forever and been accused of being haters. And now the liberal veneer is melting and people are recognizing these latent realities that always existed beneath the surface. Without further delay, Hussam, can you share with us the main arguments of the book that you have published, Counter Revolution in Egypt? And maybe if you can also, before you get to that, just tell us how you started that journey.
This book is based on my doctoral dissertation, which I completed in 2023. I had been working on it since 2018, or by the end of 2017, to be more accurate. However, more or less, it's the product of 2 decades of involvement in the Egyptian left, in the dissident movement in Egypt, in the revolution, and in the counter revolution. Throughout the book, I'm trying to answer a few questions, but the central one is what does a counter revolution do in order to defeat an uprising? By the time I had started working on my research years ago, there was still a debate in Egypt among academics and among researchers and politicians whether what we were seeing in Egypt post 2013 was a restoration of the Mubarak regime or is it something different? I think anyone today speaking in 2026, any 5 year old can tell you that what we're seeing is something completely different, of course. But back then it was still unclear. And my research was trying to answer in what ways is the Sisi regime different from its predecessor. And I chose to focus on the Egyptian security sector, meaning the military, the police, and the mukhabarat or the GIS, the General Intelligence Service. How were they organized before 2011 and what changed after 2013? And through explaining how they were restructured, how they were handling the different portfolios and the different tasks, and their relationship with one another and the relationship with the ruler himself, I'm trying to explain and dissect this new order. Uh, so, to answer your question simply, I'm arguing that a counter revolution does not restore the old order because simply the old order has failed. Um, and when I say here failure, it's not the kind of failure that you and I, Bassam, would think of, like failure because there wasn't much respect for human rights, there wasn't social equality, and what have you. No, in the eyes of the counter revolutionaries, the old order has failed because it failed to repress the revolt. So, the kind of regime that evolves out of a successful counter revolution is usually a regime that tries to avoid the mistakes of the past as it perceives it. And in the eyes, for example, of the generals who led the 2013 military coup, and they are quoted on the record, and I say that in my book, Mubarak was too lenient, Mubarak was too weak, and we need a different kind of system in order to ensure that another catastrophe like 2011 doesn't happen again. So I'm trying to clarify and paint the picture or illustrate how did they do it.
Sam, I have a ton of questions to ask you, and I also want to get to at some point to some of the current events slash geostrategic realities that impinge on your book and on Egypt, of course. But let me before I get to my specific questions, can you tell us a little bit about the background of your involvement in the Egyptian revolution, which as I mean, some people watching know, I was I would interview you constantly, you and several a small number of people from Egypt at the time in 2011, and it was so many of the discussions were very substantive, very productive, and some were prophetic in terms of where things were headed and the concerns that you had sort of ended up manifesting, unfortunately. Can you tell us a little bit about that personal journey with the situation in Egypt as we get into the content of the book, because you're not simply, I mean, of course, people can write and authors can write wonderful work without being involved, and others who are involved may not necessarily produce, stellar work. So, in my view, you have been able to do both. So, if you can tell us a little bit about that background.
Out of the $1.5 billion that Hosni Mubarak used to receive every year from the American taxpayers' money, 1.3 billion out of which used to go to the military, while the rest was the so-called economic aid. And during times when the US administrations decreased the amount of aid given to Egypt, the military aid was never touched. It was sacred for them. And there is probably nothing more ironic than the fact that when the uprising started here in Egypt, Sami Anan, our chief of staff, was in the US for talks with the Pentagon. And when the uprising took place, initially the US administration of course, behaved in the way we all expected it to behave, which was supportive of Mubarak, their biggest agent in the Arab world. Initially, in case you don't remember, Hillary Clinton went out to assure everybody that the regime was stable and there was no fear that nothing will happen in Egypt. Joe Biden also went on TV to refuse to describe Mubarak as a dictator simply because Mubarak was a friend of the US and Israel, as he put it. But later, when the Egyptian people continued braving and facing the police repression and the attacks by the thugs, and it became clear that Mubarak was about to collapse as a regime, not just as a figure, the US started shifting rhetoric and started using the democracy rhetoric, democracy between quotes, of course. And when it became clear that Mubarak had to go or else a big explosion is going to happen at the biggest Arab country, the first institution that came to Mr. Obama's mind was the Egyptian military. And that's not a coincidence. The Egyptian military was an institution that the Americans could depend upon to, number one, bring the situation into a halt, meaning that the uprising and the further radicalization that was taking place, to be diffused by the army. Secondly, they also knew that the army would not cross America, or at least the army leadership will not cross America. These guys, at the end of the day, they are totally dependent on that US military aid. And moreover, the kind of background they've come from, since, these are Mubarak's generals, after all, would make them extremely skeptical of any sort of adventures, also between quotes, or any sort of radical, also between quotes, stands against Israel, or against the US Navy trying to pass through the Suez Canal. And one of the earliest statements by the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces was to assure everyone that Egypt will continue to honor all external or foreign agreements struck with any government, meaning that Camp David is not going to be touched, meaning that the free passage for the US Navy warships in the Suez Canal is not going to be affected, meaning that that the exports of natural gas to Israel and all other agreements which the Egyptian people have largely denounced over the past 3 decades, and for which have staged demonstrations in tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands. And I personally think that every single agreement that was struck under the dictatorship must now be put to a public referendum where the Egyptian people can get to revise and see what agreements they agree upon and what agreements were forced upon them by an illegitimate dictator.
Thank you, Bassam, for such appreciation. And for those among your viewers who don't know me, I was active and I have been active in the Egyptian left since the 1990s. I belong to the second generation that rebuilt the Egyptian left by the late 1990s. By the beginning of the 1990s, the Egyptian left had largely collapsed. And I belong to an organization that was underground at the time, and it was tiny. It was called the Revolutionary Socialists. And I belong to the second generation in that organization who joined in the second half of the 1990s. And it's my generation that started rebuilding the left on the campuses after its complete demise. And it's also my generation who led the second Palestinian Intifada solidarity protests in Egypt, which kind of triggered a chain reaction credited with the 2011 uprising eventually. I was also part of Kifaya, which was an anti-Mubarak umbrella movement that organized briefly in the years of 2004 till 2006. And I was also a labor organizer who was proud to witness and take part in the so-called Winter of Labor Discontent, which has been, or which was the biggest and the longest sustained strike action that Egypt witnessed from 2006 all the way till 2014. Actually, this was the end of the strike wave. And this was the longest that the country had witnessed since 1946, with the end of the Second World War, when we had mass strikes against the British occupation at the time. And I was a journalist also back home by training. And I was also part of the early generation of Egyptian bloggers who started the so-called blogging revolution at the time in around 2006, where we were blogging against police brutality and we were blogging dissent. I worked for a variety of also mainstream media outlets, local and international, such as the Los Angeles Times for a while. I was the managing editor of the English edition of Al Masri Al-Yawm. I was also an editor at Ahram Online. And I freelanced for several publications, whether at home or abroad. I had to leave the country in 2015 because I was running out of time. I could see that after targeting the Islamists, that it's only a matter of time before Sisi comes to the left. And I was definitely on one of those that would be among the targets. So I left Egypt by the end of 2015, and I ended up in Germany, where I'm now based.
Would you like to go a bit more systematically through the table of contents? You don't have to sort of spend a lot of time on this, but just so people know what to expect with this volume.
Sure. I'm sure that anyone who's interested in Egypt is familiar with the term the Second Republic or the New Republic. This is the term that Sisi has coined after the coup, where he used that term in order to describe his regime. And in such view, the First Republic is the one that was declared in 1953, 1 year following the Free Officers' coup in 1952. And it lasted all the way till 2013. With the coup, which Sisi dubs, of course, a revolution, Sisi started laying the foundations for a second republic. So if anyone picks up the book and starts reading, I actually start talking about the First Republic. This is my introduction. So in the chapter, A Fragmented Apparatus, I go through how the Egyptian security sector was organized during the First Republic. Because as I said earlier in the interview, I'm looking at this new regime through the prism of the security sector and how it was organized before 2011 and how it changed after 2013. So I go through dissecting the fragmented apparatus, how the Egyptian police was organized, how the General Intelligence Service was organized, how the military was organized. And I'm arguing that such security sector was fragmented because the dominant perceived threat that the regime had from 1952 all the way till 2013 was the threat of a military coup. That's what every single Egyptian ruler, from Nasser passing through Sadat and then Mubarak, were afraid of. Now, any autocrat, when they reach power, they must protect themselves from all sorts of threats and dangers if they want to remain for some time at least. But there is always a dominant perceived threat. And according to this dominant perceived threat, the security sector is organized. So the Egyptian security apparatus was fragmented. The three components of that apparatus were in competition. There was hardly any coordination between them. They didn't exchange information. They had overlapping mandates, so that the only person with the bird's eye view was the ruler of the country. And in that regards, Bassam, Egypt is not unique. This is a classic coup-proofing tactic that exists in the global south up until today. So this is the first chapter. The second chapter is on the revolution, where I start by disputing some of the arguments that used to claim, and they still claim, that the army was marginalized under Mubarak. I dispute such claims, and I try to prove that the military was still the dominant part of the apparatus, even if they did not have the front seat, and actually they were happy with their backseat position. And then I go through the events of the uprising and how did it start? How did the army react to it? And I depend on not just autoethnography, since I was there and took part in the organizing at the time, but also I depend on tons of research when it comes to the army's public statements, according to the memoirs of regime insiders. And last but not least, and this might come as a surprise for some, sometimes the best information you can get about a military that is very opaque and hardly transparent, like the Egyptian military, is through their sponsors. So if you actually go to the FOIA section at the State Department website and check out Hillary Clinton's emails, for example, from 2011, you will discover tons and tons and tons of details about what was going on inside those SCAF meetings. So I went through these declassified documents and emails, and I paint a picture of how the army took its decisions, how the army responded to the events. And then I move to the following chapter, which is Counterrevolution. And this is the chapter where basically I'm talking about the transitional period that saw the ascendance of the Muslim Brotherhood to power. And I'm also engaging with several discourses and arguments and claims about the behavior of the Muslim Brotherhood during that time, why the army had initially allied itself with the Islamists, and more importantly, why did this alliance break? Because there is a mountain of books and studies and statements and reports about why the military finally decided to launch its own coup. And they range from conspiracy theories that claim that Sisi had been planning for it from the 11th of February 2011, all the way to things related to a clash of ideology, or that the Muslim Brotherhood were creeping into the privileges and the prerogatives of the military. And I argue against this, and my argument is the main central reason why this alliance got fractured was the inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to defuse the revolution on the streets. And I go through almost every single argument that had been put forward by pundits otherwise to dispute them. I also go through how the army behaved during the transitional period following Mubarak's collapse, how the generals were scrambling in order to basically contain the militancy that had started to reach their base soldiers and junior officers. What tools did the army use in order to contain such revolt? And then I go through how each component of the repressive apparatus dealt with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I also dispute some of the claims that the General Intelligence Service, or at least its leadership, were part of the coup. Actually, I claim and I argue that they were not involved in the coup. Then the following chapter, which I dubbed the State Uber Alice, I basically start going through how Sisi organized the repressive apparatus following the coup. How did he bring the military into order? Which generals did he use? I go through the profiles and the bios of his ministers of defense, his chiefs of staff, his directors of military intelligence. I go through the carrot and stick approach that he used with dissenters in the military, as well as dissenters in the General Intelligence Service. I go through how the Ministry of Interior was reorganized and unleashed against the Islamists and the revolutionary forces, and how did the Ministry of Interior basically get modernized and upgraded to face such threats of the uprising. And then the following chapter, I go through basically how each apparatus inside the state, when it comes to civil service, say the Ministry of Youth and Sports, the Culture Ministry, the Education Ministry, and the other civilian ministries, how were they run and managed by the regime during the First Republic, and how this changed with the Second Republic. And I go through which security apparatus is dealing with which file. And sometimes I even mention lists and names of the officers involved. Excuse me. Last but not least, the final epilogue, I am speculating whether this regime is sustainable or not. And I'm arguing that this regime is not actually sustainable. It is true that Sisi managed to squash dissent of all shades. It is true that Sisi managed to dismantle the opposition, dismantle civil society, militarize state organs. But at the same time, it's not a success story when it comes to governance, when it comes to the economy. And in so many ways, Egypt today is in a much, much, much more fragile position than it was previously. And it is most likely will be a subject to either an implosion or an explosion sometime in the coming years.
But thank you for this. This is something that I always appreciate, especially that these podcasts are usually circulated in classrooms as well. So we're trying to make it also instructive in that manner. I will do a bit of a deeper dive into some specific aspects that you may or may not have addressed. I want to start with a basic question on one of your arguments about Sisi and how he didn't simply restore Mubarak's system, but created and rebuilt a new one. He rebuilt the state by unifying Egypt's previously fragmented security apparatus, and you can address that at any length. So the question is, what institutionally, at the level of the institutions after 2013, made repression more centralized? How did things change, or more extreme in some cases, as we have seen, and more permanent, or sort of more enduring than before? And I say this, I ask this also with the idea in mind that the regime presents itself as a revolutionary regime that has actually been the fruit of the democratic movement. And although Egyptians know quite well what's happening in Egypt, there is a misunderstanding as to where we're at right now in Egypt, and the state media machine and propaganda has been in some ways successful, right? So if you can address all of this with the latter part of my question in mind, if you don't mind.
The fragmented apparatus that existed in Egypt from 1952, as crafted by the military intelligence Lieutenant Colonel Zakaria Muhyiddin, who was dubbed Nasser's Beria. This kind of formula lasted all the way up until 2013. One of the first things that Sisi actively sought doing after the coup was to unify the security apparatus, because now they have a different dominant perceived threat, which is the threat of popular unrest. Any regime that's facing this threat, according to studies and several political scientists whom I cite also in the research, they tend to unify their apparatus, make it much more harmonious. So Sisi presided over different structures, formal and informal, that included the heads of the different security agencies in order to ensure that they exchange information, that they coordinate, that they do not compete with one another. More or less, the military has established itself as the apex ruler of the country. But this does not mean that the other components of the apparatus have been marginalized. On the contrary. Now, this unification process was not simple and was not easy. You have a mammoth state that existed in Egypt since 1952. And in order to change the modus operandi of such security agencies, you cannot just do it with a written decree or just by some verbal order. One of the first things that Sisi did just immediately following the coup is to install Mohammed Farid al-Tuhami as the director of the General Intelligence Service on the 5th of July 2013, literally 2 days after the coup. Why was the former GIS director sacked? Because he was not part of the coup planning. Contrary to all the conspiracy theories that are being said now, when they tell you تمرد صنيعة المخابرات, or the Mukhabarat did the coup. The Mukhabarat was not actually part of the coup. At least its leadership was not. And this wasn't due to some revolutionary democratic tendencies among the GIS leadership, but simply because the GIS leadership did not view the occurrence of a coup as something that will be positive for the stability of the country. And instead, they were advocating some kind of gradual reforms that might diffuse the militancy in the streets and achieve stability. So in that regards, Sisi purged the General Intelligence Service. And I managed to get hold of tons of documents. Many of them are decrees that were published in the official gazette, and others that were leaked, that basically draws the picture of the level of the purges that happened in the GIS in the years following the coup. Those who were purged, again, were not revolutionary Democrats, but they were senior officials in the GIS who wanted to return to the Mubarak old authoritarian formula of having a fragmented apparatus, of the security services taking the back seat and empowering some civilian structures and civilian institutions to run the country while they are giving directives in the back. They did not endorse Sisi's approach of the military cannibalizing the rest of the state organs, the military taking the front seat together with the other security services, and ruling over the country without civil society, without descending NGOs, without political parties, without a functioning parliament, without any civilian institution, Bassam. in Egypt. Every single thing you can think about at this point in Egypt is either run directly or indirectly by the military. So I go through the details of how did Sisi unify this apparatus and the impact of such unification. The impact of such unification was the highest level of carceral and lethal violence in the history of modern Egypt. Egypt, we had never seen this level of repression. Even under Nasser, who people always like to cite his days as, the days of the military dictatorship, let alone under Mubarak. I always say it, Mubarak compared to Sisi is a human rights activist. So this kind of carceral and lethal violence, it's unprecedented. And in my book, I go through also the details of such dynamics and who's doing the killing, which agency, and inside that agency, which even department is doing what. So this is briefly what I'm trying to argue in that regards, but it's a tricky argument because such unity, and I'm saying that clearly at the end of the book, is not guaranteed to last forever. And actually, you can start seeing some cracks that are taking place inside that apparatus and inside that harmonious unity. And this is under the weight of failure in the economy, mainly. You mentioned ideology, and it is true that Sisi has put so much emphasis on ideology compared to Mubarak, at least. Mubarak was pretty much unideological. Yeah, I mean, patriotism and Egyptian nationalism it's always on part of the staple, but it under Sisi, he took it to a completely different level. And it's mixed also with rehashed conspiracy theories that some people dub as the fourth generation warfare, that talks about how wars now are being fought through some proxies and agents from within, people like Hossam El-Hamalawy and Bassam Haddad, who are traitors, and they want to bring down the state from within. And all the security sector institutions are in an existential fight in order to protect the state from such agent provocateurs. So this is mainly my argument when it comes to this point.
Uh, I really would like to address some of the points, but I really would also at the same time need to move on to a couple other questions because I know I've already kept you for some time. So Hussam, in the book you describe Egypt's war on terror as less about security and more about social control, which is not new, given that this has been also the case in Syria and other Arab states that sort of aided the global war on terror, and that you share that it long predates Sisi, and of course it expanded massively under Mubarak, naturally after 2001. How did counterterrorism become the main tool for governing society itself, or the main sort of excuse slash mechanism, because it has cover, and not just about fighting militants? So we think of we think of counterterrorism as addressing quote unquote terrorists, whether or not this claim or this designation is factual. But we don't think about social control as much at least not as much when we talk about counterterrorism within repressive regimes.
The roots for Egypt's war on terror it could be shared universally. I know that every country would have its own boogeyman and its own target, and it differs from time to another. Sometimes it's communist subversives, other times it's drug dealers, third time it's Islamist terrorists, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and what have you. But the dynamics are more or less universal. Um, let me go back to Egypt when it comes to that point, and I think you will definitely find parallels with other countries in that regard. When did the first Egyptian war on terror launch or unleashed? It's not a coincidence that our first war on terror started in 1991, 1992, for a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons, in my view, and that's what I'm arguing in the book, 1991, 1992 was also the start of the AirSAP program, which is an acronym for the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program. This was the neoliberal transition under Mubarak. Excuse me. This was the neoliberal transition under Mubarak with the sponsorship of the IMF and the World Bank. Wars on terror, wars on drugs, wars on crime, they usually go hand in hand with austerity policies. This is not my own argument. Other sociologists and political scientists and security experts have made this argument before, but I do apply it and I test those arguments when it comes to Egypt. It was very convenient for the regime to launch this war on terror. And in fact, the Islamist insurgency more or less had lost steam by 1994, 1995. But the war on terror policies in Egypt, they continued all the way up until the 2011 revolution, unabated. And one of the main reasons is that it's very useful for the state to declare a permanent state of emergency and militarize its police forces and to stifle all forms of dissent in the name of fighting this alleged threat, be it terrorism or drug dealers or criminals or what have you. And while this war is happening, austerity policies are being implemented. And this would mean automatically that any form of resistance to such austerity will be met with that same force that was supposedly devoted to counterterrorism. And again, this was around the time when I joined university. I joined university in 1995 at the height of the war on terror. And I do remember what Egypt was like at the time. The police was occupying all the public squares in the country. Checkpoints used to go up at night in many of the main streets and even the side streets in the country. You could not whisper Hosni Mubarak's name. Student activism was largely confined to the campuses. And once the students stepped outside the campus, they were risking being shot, basically. Industrial actions were suspended by force, including infamous cases where the police special forces used live ammunition against strikers. And this is the kind of atmosphere that Egypt was groomed in the 1990s. It's only with the second Palestinian Intifada that revived street politics in the country. And it started gradually to create for us a margin to organize in the streets, a margin that we fought for by our teeth and nails. And the pro-Palestine movement metamorphosed into the anti-Iraq war movement, which metamorphosed into Kifaya. And such electrification in the country has created cycle of protests, which more or less spilled over to the working class later. You cannot separate the outbreak of the industrial militancy by the end of 2006 from all the previous years of political mobilizations in the country. So this is our first war on terror. Our second war on terror was declared by Sisi following the 2013 military coup. He infamously gave a famous, widely publicized speech where he called for tafwid, a mandate from the people to fight the potential terror threat. And this was by the end of July, on the 26th of July, 2013. And the state used mass mobilizations from below in order to empower its apparatus in order to crack down then on the opposition. This was a fascist moment in the history of Egypt where public fear psychosis whipped up by the mainstream media that was linked with the private business tycoons in the country and also manipulated by the military. They created this fascist moment, if we can call it this way, in the country, where sections of the population, mainly the middle class, but not only the middle class, were yearning for stability, were willing to rally behind the military in order to pacify the country. Those same sections today are screaming and crying, of course, because their economic privileges and their economic situation actually deteriorated much more than it was. And Sisi's rosy dreams that he had promised them in 2013 did not bring any results to their well-being. So the war on terror in that regards was a war on the revolution, was a war to pacify the country, was a war to dismantle Egypt's civil society, was a war to break and neutralize the opposition political parties, not just the Islamists, but also the secular, whether it's left-wing or liberal-leaning organizations and parties. It was a war on even apolitical charities. Any form of entities, networks, organizations, parties that were independent from the state structures were crushed using the war on terror. And the same discourse, more or less, is being used by the regime up until today, whether trying to scare the public from the years of instability that the country saw after 2011, whether it's through the Ramadan TV soap operas that are being produced by a general intelligence service run media company called the United Media Services, where the Muslim Brotherhood are the ones to blame for the dollar crisis. They are the ones to blame for the traffic. They are the ones to blame for power cuts in the country. It's beyond parody at this point. And again, the war on terror or counterterrorism is the ideology or discourse used here by the regime.
My next to last question, even though I would like to talk about various aspects, and I promised you, or at least I didn't promise you. Of course, I promised you, but I shared with you that I would like us to have a conversation about actual ongoings in Egypt today and for the past years, and how people, including myself, notwithstanding my recent trip to Egypt, really feel that we don't know enough about Egypt, especially after 2013. But in all cases, in your book, you write that today's Egyptian state operates less like a government with a social contract with its people and more like a colonial occupying power ruling its own population. And you wonder why you are not popular with the authorities. What does that mean in practice? And why is it that this model ultimately is unstable despite the ubiquitous mechanisms of control and coercion?
As I was trying to explain earlier, the dominant perceived threat now of the ruling regime that has been running the country since 2013 is the dominant perceived threat of popular unrest. Um, yeah, Sisi still shuffles the military senior command almost on an annual basis, unlike Hosni Mubarak, because he also does. I mean, he's trying to take his own precautions when it comes to any general amassing and staying in position for a long time to be a threat. He's definitely trying to protect himself from all sorts of conspiracies, but his dominant perceived threat, the thing that keeps him up at night, the thing that he always mentions in almost every single speech that he gives, is 2011 and the prospects of 2011 happening again. Um, so when I say that the regime is behaving like a colonial power, it is a colonial power without colonizers. It's a colonial power of people who are brown-skinned Egyptians who look more or less like me. They are not the white British colonizers. They are not the Yankees. But they have adopted more or less the tactics of the counterinsurgencies that came out of the colonial counter-revolutionary wars. They regard the people, more importantly, as the enemy. Their enemy is domestic. Their enemy is their own people. Uh, their own people whom they think are ungrateful, whom they think are incapable of running the country, who think that they are not ready for democracy, who cannot organize anything for themselves. And if just Egypt is being run like how a military camp is run, we would be in a different place. Now, the irony here is the military has actually managed to get away with this project. They turned the country into a military camp. They cannibalized the civilian state organs. They even started from the earliest attempts was in 2017, but this went on full scale starting from 2023, that the Egyptian Military Academy is now in charge of vetting uh, the future civil servants, meaning any applicant for any civil service job in Egypt, whether it is a diplomat, a judge, a prosecutor, a railway driver, a railway technician, an educator, a school principal, an imam at the Awqaf ministry, a mosque imam. You have to go through a 6 months ideological indoctrination boot camp at the Egyptian Military Academy, where you are treated as a conscript. You receive physical education. physical training. You wake up in the morning, you start running left and right, and doing all of these like military marches. And you take also a bunch of crap when it comes to ideology about the fourth generation warfare, the conspiracies against the country, how the military is the superior institution in the country. And no matter whether you are qualified for your job or not, it's the Egyptian Military Academy that says in the end that you will be a civil servant or not. This has meant also, Bassam, that, for example, pregnant women who were applying for school teaching jobs were disqualified because they couldn't go through the physical training. This means that people who were 3 or 4 kilos heavier than the weight that has been determined by the Egyptian Military Academy, they were regarded as too obese to be a school principal, for example. This has gone beyond parody at this point. It's post-Orwellian. It's not even Orwellian in the country. On the one hand, this managed to keep Sisi in power for roughly a decade, but it's not a sustainable model because the current regime now is ruling solely through coercion. There isn't any consent. Outside the tiny circle of the senior army brass and the senior officials of the security apparatus in Egypt, I would say that this regime doesn't have much legitimacy or much support. Now, they can definitely always play the card of the external enemy and the Zionist conspiracies here, the Zionist conspiracies there, and it's Asian provocateurs who are trying to smear the achievements of the regime. But it's the ordinary Egyptian at this point who can't see anything good that's coming out of it. So with this economic crisis that the country is going through, which will only deepen because now we are at a level of foreign debt that is just astronomical. When Sisi took over the presidency, Egypt's foreign debt stood at roughly 40 or 41 billion dollars. Today, it's over 160 billion dollars, and it will only increase. The debt service, just servicing the debt, like just paying the interests, is eating up more than 60% of the government revenues at this point. This is not a sustainable situation. And what the regime does is that almost every 2 or 3 months that they would go and borrow money, either from the Gulf or from the IMF or from other international donors, just to stay afloat. But such loans, they come with strings attached. These strings are not just political in terms of Egypt's regional clout is now down the drains, but it's also economic that entitles more austerity at this point. The water services have been privatized and the water cost is drinking water is increasing. Electricity, the prices are going up. Subsidies on fuel have been largely lifted. Every single thing in Egypt, and you've just been there, as you were saying, I mean, the prices are astronomical at this point. One thing that if you're a sociologist, you can catch it easily, is that we have this phenomena on Facebook now, where you find these Facebook groups that are mushrooming left and right, and whose members are upper middle class Egyptians, just selling their furniture, selling their clothes, selling their carpets, selling their antiquities, selling their jewelry. I personally know people who have more or less stopped visiting friends in other neighborhoods because they can't afford the transport costs at this point. So it's not a sustainable situation. And at the same time, I'm not saying that the regime will explode tomorrow. Um, but we are at a point where the situation is very critical. And as someone who's involved in the labor movement, even in exile, I can tell you that there is a slow incremental rise in the number of industrial actions and in their geographical scope that have been taking place in Egypt in recent years. Now, these strike actions are largely spontaneous. They are largely independent from any political party or organization. They lack the experienced veteran organizers of the previous strike wave that was from the 2006 till 2014, or the winter of labor discontent. Um, but it is increasing, it is expanding slowly. When will this explode into full mass strikes? I honestly don't know, because again, Sisi had managed to cripple most of our organizations. Even when that is also slowly changing recently with the slight political revival in dissent in the country. But it could happen at any point. It could happen as I'm speaking to you now. It can happen next year. It can happen 2 years down the road. All I know is that the situation is not sustainable.
I'm just pausing. There's a lot. Uh, this makes a strong argument for having a conversation as to what is it that's happening today, and the question of sustainability, because there are no visible indications for anything other than sustainability on the one hand. But the more you know and learn about what's going on in terms of the daily life of people in Egypt and the expanding economic devastation for large swaths of the population, and the major macroeconomic disasters such as the debt. I mean, we talked about this before. I spoke with our common friends, because this is a major campaign, of course, as well in Egypt, that feel free to address. So it'll be important to talk about this. And if somebody's watching, if when people who are watching, if you're interested, please stay tuned, because we will be having a series on what's going on in Egypt, and we will announce it soon. In the meantime, before I ask you the last question, actually on Palestine, I would like to share with everyone that again that Hossam writes a number of articles on a regular basis on his Substack, which is featured here. If you can see on the screen, it's on arabawi.substack.com. Arabawi starts with a number 3, which signifies the letter A in Arabic, which doesn't exist in many other languages. So it's arabawi@substack.com. It's invaluable. I am an avid subscriber and reader, and I get Hussam's articles from friends who actually sends them out for people who are not, following, to either subscribe or to read. I do urge you to subscribe. This is a very important sort of newsletter, if you will, and those of us academics who are, right now in a more precarious situation, are using these methods to sort of express our views and our scholarship, as well as a source of support and income. So please do take seriously the importance of subscribing. You will not be disappointed. At the same time, it's like very easy and affordable. Let me actually show 1 second. Let me show the here we are. Where is it? Yeah. So this is the page, basically the State and Barracks Substack. And before we move to the last question, Hossam, do you mind telling us a little bit about this Substack? And I understand from you that you recently changed the title to State and Barracks, the Nexus of Military, Money, and the State in Egypt. And you have over 1,000 subscribers. And we hope that others will consider subscribing. But first, tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about what you have within the Substack.
Sure. I use Substack in order to publish weekly, every Monday at 8 a.m. Berlin time. I publish a report, a long report, discussing the Egyptian security sector, meaning the latest trends, developments, analysis regarding the military and GIS and the Egyptian Interior Ministry, the situation when it comes to political dissent in the country. I'm trying to shed light on these issues, which are hardly discussed now in the Western mainstream media, and actually even in local Egyptian mainstream media, because our media more or less has now been taken over literally by the General Intelligence Service. And on Thursdays, I usually publish a book review. It could be something contemporary or a recent publication, or something historical. As you can see now, like my latest book review, for example, was an old manuscript from 1971 on the foundation of the Sudanese military and the role of Egypt and the British Empire in doing so. Definitely, I appreciate your support for this newsletter, Bassam. And I hope that your viewers would consider subscribing and to find it useful and valuable for their work.
Absolutely. And as you saw, actually, I just saw a couple of things that I hadn't seen before, which means I have to go back. And so there's a few pieces here: military, police, intelligence, who governs the provinces now in Egypt, and then another one, who gets to be legitimate. This is also another piece from February 19th with a picture of Reagan. Is that Reagan?
Yeah, it's a study actually which I reviewed. It's about how armed groups get to be legitimate and what dynamics are involved. And this is part of the reviews that I usually publish on Thursdays. Every now and then, I also publish an audio podcast, but this is not regular. But I'll do my best to produce it regularly in the near future.
I was gonna say, انت فاكر ريجن يا مرسي؟ طبعا when I say Morsi, people are gonna think I'm referring to the ex-president. I'm referring instead to an Egyptian play. And the reason I say انت فاكر Reagan, which means do you remember Reagan? It's because we have some serious issues with the politics of the United States in the 1980s under Reagan, but compared to what's been happening, it's like, let's يعني معلش, let's
it's the same with Mubarak and Sisi,
يعني معلش, let's go back to Reagan دخيلك. Not really.
Yeah.
Okay, Habibi, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate you going over this. That of course the stories are really remarkable here. And then last question is on the question of Palestine. You have published a piece called "From Palestine to Tahrir Square: What Egyptians Owe Palestinians," and this was published in May 2024. بأوج as we say in the in the middle of the ongoing genocide. Um, and the different parts here, I'll just read them closely. I mean, quickly. From 1968 to the 1977 bread uprising, which means you go through the history, which is why people should really take a look at your work, because you don't do hot takes. You actually unearth the background, the players, the actors, the geo strategic or local setting before you address the topic, from the first Intifada to the first Egyptian war on terror, and then from the second Intifada to the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, and then the 2013 Counterrevolution, which is close to your the book title. So, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of connection between your book on the one hand and the question of Palestine, or what is happening today in Egypt and the question of Palestine, not least amidst the US funded Israeli genocide in Gaza?
As you were saying, this article appeared in the midst of the genocide, which may have toned down a little bit now, but it's still ongoing. The situation in Gaza is it's I mean, what can I say? And in this article, I was trying to explain why is Egypt complicit? Why is the Egyptian regimes, not just Sisi, they tend to be anti-Palestinian? And my argument was every single turning point in the history of Egyptian descent, and I'm talking here like modern Egyptian history, has been either directly or indirectly linked to the Palestinian cause. When Egyptians see Palestinians resisting, they tend to draw parallels. They tend to ask questions about why isn't our government doing enough to help the Palestinians? Why is our government actually collaborating with the Israelis? And this Palestine solidarity sentiments, they quickly turn into anti-regime dissent in the country. That's why the Egyptian regimes, not just Sisi, they hate the Palestinians. They fear their impact. During the first Palestinian Intifada, for example, Safwat Sharif, who was Mubarak's information minister, issued directives to the state-run TV at Maspero at the time in order to censor news about the Intifada, because it was impacting and inflaming the Egyptian campuses at the time. During the second Palestinian Intifada, remember we were talking earlier about the 1990s and how the war on terror squashed all forms of dissent in the country. But street politics only got revived with the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada, which soon triggered mass protests in the country. Protests that started simply with just empathy and sympathy with the Palestinians, only to turn quickly into anti-regime of nature. The first time in my life that I heard thousands chanting against Hosni Mubarak was in April 2002. Before that, Bassam chanting against Hosni Mubarak was suicidal and something completely off the wall, too radical. But in April 2002, during Operation Defensive Shield by Ariel Sharon in the West Bank, which triggered mass protests in the campuses and professional syndicates in Egypt, I heard thousands of people during clashes with the Central Security Forces in what became known as the Cairo University Intifada. They were chanting حسني مبارك زي شارون نفس الشكل ونفس اللون. Hosni Mubarak is just like Sharon. He's the same figure, he's the same color. And it's not a coincidence that the rise of Kifaya would take place in 2004, after 3 years of mobilizing in the streets over Palestine and over also Iraq at the time. So the second Palestinian Intifada triggered a long chain reaction that eventually led to the 2011 uprising. Many of the organizers of the uprising in Tahrir and elsewhere, most of us, if not all, we all came from the ranks of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. It's through the Palestinian cause that we started to understand that the road to Jerusalem passes through Cairo. When the uprising happened, at the time, some Western pundits and some Egyptian liberals too tried to depict the events as something purely domestic, about youth demanding Western style of democracy and liberal kind of reforms. And this has got nothing to do with Israel or America or any foreign policy issues, but this is a sheer lie. Not only because in Tahrir you could see tons of posters and banners that were denouncing Hosni Mubarak as an Israeli spy, but again, many of the organizers involved in the uprising were staunchly pro-Palestinian. And it's in 2011 that the Israeli embassy was stormed, that the situation between Egypt and Israel became probably closest to the brink of almost ending the peace agreement under pressure from the street. So in that regards, you can understand why the counter-revolution has been exacting revenge against every single cause that the counter-revolution perceived as one that triggered the uprising. And on the top of the list comes the Palestinian cause. That's why the siege of Gaza became much, much more worse than it was. That's why Sisi tried his best to squeeze Hamas out of power. That's why with this current genocide in Gaza, the Egyptian army stood by watching idly the genocide that's happening literally a few meters away from it. That's why Sisi was more or less complicit in what happened, and with the way that he mismanaged completely the Rafah crossing. Although he tried to claim later that he was foiling the conspiracy to transfer the Palestinians into Sinai, but everyone could see that more or less he was in hands with the Israelis. Whether when it comes to ensuring that food exports, cement exports arrived in Israeli ports through Egyptian ports after the Houthis more or less imposed their embargo in the Red Sea and drove the Eilat port into bankruptcy. Whether when it comes to the shutting down of the Rafah crossing, whether when it comes to completely complying with whatever Israel wanted when it comes to the entry of aid or the exit of the injured, whether when it comes to even the discourse of the media, whether when it came to the crackdown on the pro-Palestine protests that happened. Up until now, you have over 100 people who are still in jail for taking part in solidarity actions with the Palestinians since October 2023. But you should not be surprised the level of animosity that the regime has towards the Palestinian is a function of how much the Egyptian people find the Palestinians inspiring.
I really hope that people will go out and purchase the book. When is it coming out of Verso?
On the 5th of May.
5th of May?
Yeah,
Why are
it's
we doing
soon.
this now then? No, I'm joking.
Well, people can pre-order.
No, I'm just joking. Akid, I'm joking. People can pre-order on verso.com.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I would do. I cheated because you shared with me some of the aspects or content, but this is what I'll be doing. I urge everyone to do that. I also urge people to take a look at the arabawi.substack.com Substack for Hossam, and subscribe. And I also ask everyone to look forward to the conversations we will be having with a number of Egyptian scholars and authors, and beyond. Like, we're not just speaking with scholars, we're also going to be speaking with journalists and potentially others, artists, activists, and so on, about a new series on Egypt. In the meantime, Hossam, I just want to thank you so much that you've been here with us for quite some time already.
It's always a pleasure speaking to you.
We're going up on
I really
1
appreciate it.
hour 45 minutes. Is there anything else you would like to say in closing before we release you?
Well, first, I must thank you for giving me the space and the platform in order to speak tonight. And I don't want your viewers to give up on Egypt. I know that Egypt is not has not been in the news for a very long time for very understandable reasons. But I believe that anyone who's truly supportive of the Palestinians and want to see the liberation of Palestine must pay attention to Egypt. If we had a revolutionary regime in Egypt, this genocide would not have happened. If we had a revolutionary regime in Egypt, the entire region would have looked completely different. So even when we got defeated, but this is not the end of the story, and international solidarity and support will always be essential for the revival of the Egyptian revolution.
Absolutely. Shukran, Hussam, and I will see you soon. Thanks to everyone who is listening
Bassam.
and watching. Salam. Thank you.
Salam, Bassam.
Bye, Habibi.
Yeah. Bye-bye.